Well, joining me now, Professor of History at Yale University, Tim Snyder, Pulitzer Prize-winning author Anne Applebaum, and Brian Klaas from the London School of Economics. Very good evening to you. Anne, do you agree with the premise of what I was saying, that authoritarian nationalism as a creed is on the rise?
I'm not sure if it's authoritarianism on the rise so much as the doubts about democracy have grown. In an era when we can do so many things so easily, we can click a button and something arrives in the mail the next day. We can demonstrate our views for something by liking something. Democracy seems to many people very tedious and cumbersome. It takes a long time for people to make decisions. The way in which people now process information is different. They want instant news, they want instant opinions. And of course, democracy is more cumbersome. It does take longer to make decisions. And this is something that's been true about it for decades. And this was exactly the same critique of it that was made in the 1930s, the last time we had a rise of authoritarianism in Europe and the West.
Right. And Brian, do you agree with that? That it's more a kind of, people are just a bit fed up with things as they are and the system as it is? Because that graph, and it was you, in fact, who showed us that graph of the declining faith in democracy in different countries. It's astonishing. It's astonishing.
It is. We've had a huge reversal in the last 10 years, I would say, in the sense that, we believed initially that there was this end of history moment, that everyone was marching toward liberal democracy at the end of the Cold War. And now we've seen 10 years of declines where authoritarian regimes have been on the march or become more authoritarian around the world. I also think that this idea that democracy is losing some faith is definitely true. And, we had an 18-month-long advertisement in the United States for why democracy is problematic. Nobody looked at that election between Trump and Clinton and thought, wow, I really wish we had that. It looked like an advertisement against democracy rather than for it.
Right. Well, we've got two propositions here. One is democracy less popular. The other is the potential idea that authoritarians are more popular. Tim Snyder, can I ask you, do you think authoritarian, strong leaders are kind of voguish at the moment, that there's a feeling among voters, whether it's in the Philippines or in India or in so many different places, that somehow strong characters with charisma are just the solution to most of life's problems?
Well, look, strong characters with charisma always have an edge over weak characters without charisma. I think we have to look a little deeper. It strikes me that a couple of things are going on. The first thing in the West, as the graph suggests, is that people who were born later really don't have a sense of what it would mean to lack democracy. I think it's a bit like with Brexit. If you can't imagine what it's going to be like to lose what you have, you're more likely to put it at risk. A second thing which I think should be stressed is that a number of these places, Russia is the extreme, America is heading in this direction, are characterized by extreme inequality, and the rulers who you're calling authoritarian are often more like kleptocrats who are surrounding themselves with a form of ideology which is meant to distract attention from the fact that the state can't handle inequality. Russia is an extraordinarily unequal society. Attention is distracted away from that by foreign adventures. When you criticize democracy in the US, one has to take into account what's being criticized is a system where corporations and other groups can make unlimited donations, and where Americans were drawn to Donald Trump in part by the argument that he, who claimed to be a billionaire, could protect them from the other billionaires. That's a problem inside the system, and a problem which, at least in principle, could be repaired.
Right, so that's very interesting. But Tim, just on that, why, if people are concerned about inequality, do they vote for Donald Trump rather than, say, a more conventional type politician saying we need to do something about inequality? You don't have to respond to that by voting for such a populist. You might vote for someone who's a policy kind of geek who has all sorts of ideas about how to reform trade in sort of well thought through ways. I mean, why would you vote for Donald Trump in those circumstances?
Well, I mean, your question indicates why we shouldn't over-dramatize the situation, dramatic as it is, because that's what Americans in fact did. Hillary Clinton, who fits the description of a technocrat with lots of policy proposals, won at least 2.5 million more votes than Donald Trump, and in a fair fight, she would have won the election, right? But I mean, I don't want to dodge the question. There's an answer to it, and the answer is, when you have a political party, in our case it's the Republicans, which presents itself as anti-system, and defines the problem as always being the system itself, Eventually you get to the extreme of that argument, and the extreme of that argument is the problems come from the outside. They come from the rest of the world. So Trump is saying he's going to handle the problem of inequality. It's just that his recipe is to blame it on the Chinese, the Mexicans, or the Jews. Whether we like it or not, that is also an argument about inequality. It's not the right argument. It's a dangerous argument, but it's an argument that did resonate with a fair number of people.
Tim, thank you. Brian, I know you have an interest in this. Inequality and support for these kind of outsiders, there is a link, is there?
Well, I think that there's a lot of anger at the establishment over inequality, but if 2016 was sort of the election that broke the establishment, 2017 is going to be the year where they have to actually govern, right? I mean, they now have to deliver. And so Trump has been, set up to do something that is impossible. How is he going to bring back coal jobs to West Virginia? It's not going to happen. And as soon as that becomes clear, I think we might have the pendulum swing back in favor of the technocratic geeks you talked about, hopefully that take the problems of these type of people more seriously, but in a way that's reasoned and methodologically driven and thoughtful. And that's not what we have in Donald Trump.
Right. Anne, do you just quickly on this link between inequality and these kind of outsiders coming in, do you buy that as a strong link?
I think inequality is part of the story in the way that 2008 is part of the story, and there are a lot of pieces of why this is happening right now. But I really wouldn't underestimate this cultural point. People are looking for people are looking for simpler and faster and easier ways to do things. Donald Trump promises them, magical things. I can fix it. I can save America, and I can make America great again. He's offering a form of nostalgia, in effect, a kind of revolutionary nostalgia. I can bring America back to where it was, which is incidentally the same kind of theme that was used in the Brexit campaign. We can make Britain the way it was before, and it's underlying theme in quite a lot of these populist elections.
Right. Before I go back to Tim, I want to ask you each. Is this time to panic? Is this a crisis in democratic countries? Is this time to panic about the institutions that we've come to know and love? Or is this just, hey, they come and they go, these idiots will come into power, and then the next idiots will come into power? That's the way democracy works. I mean, are you panicking yet, Anne?
So I don't think panic is really the right response, but I think reinforcing the institutions, reteaching them to people who don't remember, teaching people history, teaching people what happened before the last time we gave up on democracy. This is something that has to be done over and over and over again in every generation.
One always ends up sounding a bit like one's over-dramatising it if you go back to the fascists and the Nazis and draw these parallels.
I mean, look, history never repeats itself in exactly the same way. But Tim's point in the beginning was absolutely right. There's now a generation of people in their 20s and 30s and maybe even 40s who just don't remember what the alternatives were like. And so, yes, it's very important to keep on telling them, keep explaining, and also to look at what are the real deficits in our society. What are the institutions that are weak? I mean, these elections have shown that there are real weaknesses all across the West, and it's time to address some of those in a much more vigorous and aggressive way.
Brian, are you panicking about the state of democracy?
I'm panicking a lot more than I was, a month ago. And that's because of Trump's election primarily. But I would also say that I think we need to reinvigorate the narrative of democracy, why it matters. It's not just about history, it's also about its future. And I also think that we need to dispel this myth that all the authoritarian governments in the world are like Singapore, right? Everyone sort of always talks about Singapore as this model for growth. But if you could choose where to be born and you didn't know whether you were going to be born in an authoritarian state or a democratic state, you would be insane to pick authoritarian because you'd end up in Eritrea most likely as opposed to Singapore or China. And so these models that are touted as sort of the authoritarian, shining pedestal are just outliers. And most democracies function much better than authoritarian states, but no one's really making that argument because in the West we've taken democracy for granted.
Well, we're self-flagellating ourselves a lot as well and saying it's all wrong and we've let everybody down.
Yeah.
Tim, just take us through how you think this plays out over the next 5 years. I don't get the feeling you're panicking, or at least not yet. How does Trumpism, how does that end?
Well, let me start in a slightly different place, because I think in the West, at least, the trend begins in Russia in 2011 and 2012, when they ostentatiously fake elections and then essentially make it their foreign policy doctrine that they're going to mess with elections in other places. We've now kind of reached the logical end of that, where the United States, which was supposed to be the great enemy of Russia, has now moved in a direction closer to Russia by means which in many ways are Russian means, thereby denying Russia its outside enemy. We've now tilted towards a point where this kind of pseudo-nostalgic authoritarianism is normal. Who's going to be the enemy now, right? One thing I worry about in particular is the manufacture of enemies. I don't think people should panic about it, to use your word, but I do think we ought to be concerned about how societies of this type or leaders of this type react to or provoke extreme events like, for example, 9/11, or like, for example, the Reichstag fire in 1933 in Germany. We have to be very concerned that, as was suggested before, leaders who don't have true policies may need emergency or a sense of emergency to govern. That's one thing I'm worried about in the next 5 years. Another thing that I'm concerned about in the next 5 years is the creation of true alternatives. The problem with the narrative since 1989 was that there aren't really alternatives. When we think there are alternatives, we get lax. We get complacent, right? The Democratic Party in the US, centrist parties in Europe, they become parties of the status quo, they become boring. The Democratic Party in the US isn't going to return just by telling everyone how awful the first Trump administration was, awful though it will be. It's going to have to say, and now I'm repeating, it's going to have to make positive arguments in favor of what a better future is going to look like.
Tim Snyder and Brian, thanks all very much indeed.